Right, everyone, welcome, and thank you for your patience as we get situated here. Yeah. Thank you to everyone that is joining us online today. We'll be watching the chat if there's any issues there. Uh, my name's Amanda Lyons. I'm the executive director of the Human Rights Center. Really glad to have those of you that are here with us in person and joining online. And I know we will have folks tuning in for the recording after this session. We just learned a little bit ago that the students are organizing a walkout here on campus for 12 o'clock. Uh, and we kind of discussed it internally and really want to, I kind of personally, as Amanda Lyons, want to express my solidarity with the students, and talking about it with people involved, decided to go ahead with the conversation, hoping that students that are not here could watch the discussion afterward, and really just taking advantage of the fact that we have Josh Colangelo on campus with us just for today. And among other topics, we will be thinking about and talking about the severity of the situation that we're living here in Minnesota. And so we hope that it's in keeping with the spirit of the walkout and actions that so many are taking around our city and our state. The students and the lawyers and our partners and community members, people are doing so much great work on so many different levels. And for the Human Rights Center, in addition to kind of supporting a lot of these actions, we really see the value in coming together to share ideas, to share strategies, to eat food. Everybody has to eat, right? And so really appreciate everybody taking time to come together. When we invited Josh to come to campus and talk to us, we imagined the conversation would look a little different, or at least the city would look a little different. We definitely do want to hear about Josh's ongoing work and the book and experience that is collected there doing Guantanamo work, but I also think it's a good chance for us to ask questions that are on our minds, and also for Josh and this kind of visit to Minneapolis to kind of, yes, right? So you're getting a kind of firsthand view and account. Josh was very generous to talk to some of our students this morning, and it was really valuable. So you're in for a treat hearing the expertise, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions also. I'd also like to thank and introduce Professor Chris Roberts, who is an affiliated faculty member with the Human Rights Center, doing amazing work, supporting and guiding and hearing from our student body, and really grateful that he has agreed to moderate the conversation for us. We have Josh's bio, of a small portion of it included in the event description. Josh is special counsel with Human Rights First, a really renowned human rights organization here in the United States. He has a wide range of work going on right now, and in the past has also done work abroad in several different countries that I think we'll hear about, including, I think, Syria recently. We are really fortunate to get to hear about your experience, and particularly the work with Guantanamo. Minnesota has a long history of doing pro bono Guantanamo defense, both lawyers working and organized with their firms, and here at the Human Rights Center under Professor David Weisbrot first and Professor Fionnuala Ní Aoláin after. And so it's an issue and a concern of kind of long tradition here in Minnesota, and we are looking forward to hearing about all of it. So I turn it over to you two, and thank you.
I want to thank you, Amanda, and the Human Rights Center, the university, the law school, and all of you who are here today, given what is going on in our community. I really, I'm often at a loss for words. And from time to time, you'll have to excuse me when I think about all that is going on and don't necessarily have a name or a word for what it is that we're experiencing. And at the same time, know how important it is for us to work together, even if we don't have the words, to really try. And one of the things that struck me in Joshua's book is that I'm sure when you were afterwards, when said, what the hell? And the cruel, the to get by healing.
Think even before thinking about the possibility of what words I lacked, there were times when I felt like I couldn't even fully examine the broad context of what our government was doing, because that would be such an overwhelming exercise and would leave you feeling pretty impotent to do anything at all. And I've had the same experience working in other countries, whether it's Syria or Bahrain or Kosovo. My personal approach, and this is going to sound horribly small in a certain sense, is just to try to figure out what little task I could take on next that in some way is related to trying to push back against a government's illegal, immoral actions. Sometimes the big picture is just too big for me. And in order not to feel paralyzed and despondent, I need to try to make a list of a couple of things that I might do on a particular case to help a particular client, just so that I know where to move next, as opposed to sitting there stunned into inaction.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we could begin by you just talking about the book, for those of us, which I assume is most of us, haven't had a chance to read it yet. Could you tell us what's in here? What's it all about?
So at the core of this story, in my view, is a relationship between a Saudi Arabian man who was held at Guantanamo and his American lawyer, who I think against the odds became very good friends at Guantanamo. And not to talk about myself in the third person, I am the American lawyer, so I'll go with I from now on. Um, when I went to Guantanamo, I didn't know at all what to expect from the clients we had signed up to represent, not really knowing much about them. I was, I'll admit, a little anxious before going into my first meeting with a client. It's not like I believed everything Donald Rumsfeld said, but you hear people telling you that these are the worst of the worst enough, and you start to think, well, maybe there are some bad guys down there, and maybe I'm going to be sitting in a little room with one of them across the table, and he's going to hate me just for who I am and reach out for my throat with some Al Qaeda kung fu move, and you can get yourself worked up. Pushing through that anxiety, I walked into my first meeting, which was with a client named Jobber. And as soon as he saw me, his face broke into one of the warmest smiles I've ever seen. And I understand dangerous people can have very warm smiles, so it's not like that gave me all the answers, but it certainly took the edge off. And then as I walked towards him, I saw he was trying to get up as if to shake my hand and welcome me to what passed for his abode. But he couldn't really do it because he was shackled to the floor by his ankle. So we got sort of a small handshake, sat down, and within a few minutes, we were in this easy, personable conversation talking about stuff like movies. His favorite movie was Jumanji, which I had to admit I hadn't seen. Um, he found that pretty offensive and crazy. We talked about food, we talked about family. I mean, it was sort of like just a conversation you might have when you hit it off with another human being in some normal part of life. So none of that was at all what I expected, but it really was the first stage in the development of a very close friendship. So the book talks about the legal issues, the national security issues, because this is all happening at Guantanamo, but I think the heart of it is the relationship. And I like to think that there is some resonance in that context, given what is happening today. Because just like Jabber and everyone else was sent to Guantanamo because they were the worst of the worst with no process at all, we have literally started again in 2025 sending people to Guantanamo who we are literally again calling the worst of the worst. This time it's migrants. The sort of vilification of a group of people that political leaders engage in order to justify denying them their rights is absolutely what underpinned the post 9/11 Guantanamo operation and is absolutely what underpins so much of what is happening today, but in particular, the anti-immigrant operations that we're seeing everywhere, including horribly, blocks from here. So I think, again, I like to conceive of things as, really small ways to push back because otherwise I feel overwhelmed. But I hope this is just a little effort to push back against that demagoguery that lets a government demonize an entire group of people. Because once you dig in a little bit and you meet human beings in that demonized group, the demonization really stops working.
I'm looking around and I see a number of my students. Thank you for coming. Good to see you here. Can you take us back to your law school days when you were a third year? You can. He's like, no, I don't want to.
Talking about PTSD.
And about to take the bar exam. You took the bar exam, and job lined up, and went off to Kosovo. Um, Tell us about that, because it seemed like that might have been a turning point in your career, but really in your life, and your life is part of history. So, I mean,
So I'm going to apologize to a couple of students who were in Professor Lyon's class this morning and heard this story. I don't mean to just repeat my war stories to you. But it was, boy, talk about dating yourself. The spring of 1999, I was finishing law school. I knew after I graduated, I would study for the bar, talk about PTSD, and then had a job lined up with a big law firm in Seattle. But I had negotiated with them and got some time off in between the bar and starting the job. So I was trying to think of what to do. Like, is this a good opportunity to go to Mexico and sit on a beach for 3 months? Or, maybe another trip to Italy would be good. I was reading the newspaper one day, and there was an article about how the NATO bombing campaign, which was going on that spring, was drawing to a close because Slobodan Milosevic had agreed to remove his Serbian Yugoslav forces from Kosovo. And for reasons I absolutely can't explain, the next thought I had was, oh, I should go there and try to help. When I say I can't explain, like I had never done anything remotely like humanitarian work before. I had never been in a post-conflict situation. This was not something I had any experience or qualifications for. But somehow once the idea got in my head, it was sort of love at first sight, and I knew I had to pursue it. So tried to figure out if I knew anyone in the region. I had a friend who was working at a refugee camp in Albania. Long story short, I ended up going for several months to Kosovo as a unpaid volunteer to do an emergency shelter project. The basic goal there was to create a warm, dry room in a home that had been burned out, but not bombed out. So there were still walls. And that was a technique that the Serbs used quite a bit to destroy places on the cheap. They wouldn't necessarily bomb it, they would burn it out. And there were 800,000 homes that had been burned out or in some cases destroyed. It was exponentially more compelling than anything I had ever done in any other context. I mean, just dealing with very tactile life and death issues in a place that had just been through a war. Um, whatever angst you have in your day-to-day life, to whatever extent you can be pulled in different directions by your demons, like all that goes away when you have to focus exclusively on someone else's life or death issue. And so, as you say, it was a completely life-changing event. I went from thinking I would do employment law, because like it felt important that people be treated well where they work, um, to thinking I need to be engaged one way or another with these international issues, these human rights issues, just basic questions of people being allowed to live a reasonable existence.
Yeah. Do you have any advice or suggestions, words of wisdom for the students sitting here? I've had many conversations with students over the last 6 months, a year or so, saying, where they come to my office and they say, I wanted to work in the Justice Department, or I wanted to work in human rights. I wanted to work for USAID. And already there are life-changing circumstances that they're facing, not similar to what you're, but life-changing no less. And they are trying to figure out what to do now. Do you have any suggestions for students who are in this place based on your own experience?
So I think, those of us who are not going to find adequate satisfaction with, say, the typical commercial law firm practice, like we do need to work a little harder to figure out where we can go and do work that we like, because there are tons of litigation associate jobs, right? That's an easier job to get than a job doing something primarily because you think it's good work. And that's sort of an irony in that, but it's just the financial reality. One tack, and again, I apologize for boring people who've already heard this, is, I recommend identifying places that do work that, sounds cool, sounds exciting, like gets your heart racing a little bit, and figuring out if you have an opportunity to offer yourself for free to those organizations just to start to get actual experience in whatever field that group is engaged with. I think one of the more difficult aspects of public interest work is getting in the door if your parent isn't a prominent international human rights professor or something like that. So there were a bunch of times when I was able to get law school credit to volunteer for something, or as I mentioned, in going to Kosovo the first time, where, without the benefit of a trust fund, I still was able to say, for these 3 months, I've got no dependents, I'll go work for nothing. You get experience, you also get more of a sense of whether day to day the work that organization is doing really resonates with you, or maybe not. Maybe you need to look at a slightly different path. As as I explained, my route to this kind of work was totally circuitous, unplanned, random, and not that that's how everyone will get there, but I think sometimes for people who are looking a little bit outside the mainstream, you've got to be a little scrappier and a little more willing to, make your own luck, if you will.
Right, right. You say, the work that gets your blood pumping, your heart racing. There's a very interesting line in the book where you say Guantanamo was both demoralizing and exhilarating. Can you take us to Guantanamo through those emotions, through those feelings? Talk to us about Guantanamo. Take us there, but also give us that window through both the demoralizing and the exhilarating aspect as it was in your own experience.
Guantanamo was, it was designed to be a prison beyond the law. That was the whole theory. We'll take these foreigners, we'll lock them up in Cuba, and no court will ever be able to hear their cases. Certainly no lawyers will go down to the base to talk to them. We'll be able to do whatever we want in order to, get actionable intelligence. So that was the whole purpose behind the creation of that facility. So we show up a few years later armed with a Supreme Court opinion that said, no, federal courts have jurisdiction over habeas claims, even if it's a foreigner and even if he's detained in Cuba, which is not our sovereign territory, because really we control that base completely. And according to our interpretation, we can be there forever. So you show up, and at least in the case of many of us, and in my case, you're then brown-haired, but short-haired white guy with an unmistakable American accent, and your clients have been held for 2 or 3 years, totally incommunicado, where mostly the people they've interacted with have been white guys with short hair and American accents who have said things to them like, if you don't confess that you used to, run the Thursday barbecue at the Bin Laden compound, you're never getting out of here for the rest of your life. And so the first issue is trying to create some trust with people who are in a place that was designed to rob them of all hope. That personal aspect was something that we thought about a bit in advance, but couldn't really appreciate until we were there. And that personal aspect ultimately became almost as important as the work we were doing outside the base. We were the only connection to the outside world that our clients had. They would occasionally get letters from home through the Red Cross, which mostly, even if it was like a 5-year-old kid writing you the letter, would be half redacted by the military. That aside, we were their only connection. And that becomes a pretty weighty responsibility. When you heard people describe not only the treatment they had been subjected to over the prior years, which shockingly was often corroborated by government whistleblower reports. But when they also talked about being held in near complete isolation and the demoralizing effect it had on them, it's hard not to absorb some of that demoralization. But at the same time, our job was to fight against that. And there's maybe a perverse part of me where the worse the conduct is that I'm trying to push back against, and frankly, the more pissed I am about the conduct, the more I am animated and exhilarated and in the fight. There's something about trying to stand next to a person who's being abused by someone who has more power that's, enraging and also, for me, really inspiring. I think that's how those emotions get paired.
I think we need you here in Minnesota with us. So talk to us a little bit about the dehumanizing aspect of it. I mean, those of us who are not too familiar with Guantanamo Bay have seen photographs, horrific photographs of, naked abused detainees in a pyramid, dogs gnashing their teeth at them. But your story shows that the dehumanization was much more systemic and much more part of the everyday circumstances of the detainees. Can you just give us a little snapshot to really take us there and see what we're dealing with?
Right. Professor Roberts, can you adjust your mic a little bit?
How's that? Yes? Okay, a little bit better. Okay. I'll hold it if I need to. Just keep me informed. Thank you.
Look, so let me touch on what I see as a fundamental aspect of dehumanization without which there wouldn't have been a Guantanamo at all. In the post 9/11 context, when we went into Afghanistan in theory to rout the Taliban and capture bin Laden, the government decided that the normal rules just didn't apply. We heard a lot of, we're going to have to get our hands dirty. We heard a lot of Dick Cheney saying we're going to have to go to the dark side. Part of that was the civilian leadership at the Pentagon telling the uniformed military that the hearings that the military traditionally has carried out when it grabs somebody near a battlefield to figure out, like, is this a bad guy or is this a goat farmer who just kind of happened across our path? Civilian leadership said, do not hold those hearings. And the Geneva Conventions don't apply. At the same time, we were paying substantial bounties to the Pakistani government, private Pakistani individuals, the Northern Alliance, to give us, Al-Qaeda fighters. In that context, Al-Qaeda fighter means any Arab man, basically. So we ended up detaining lots of Arab men. We applied no process to that group of people in Afghanistan to figure out bad guy, goat farmer, something else. Instead, I remember the phrase that was in a book written by an Army interrogator there: if you were Arab, you had a one-way ticket to Guantanamo. So it was essentially a notion that any Arab man is effectively a terrorist, which incidentally we implemented in the States, arresting thousands of people, often on material witness warrants, none of whom was ever found to have done anything illegal. But that's the underlying assumption, that's the underlying sort of vilification, which was paired with a total absence of process, let alone due process. So by the time these people got to Guantanamo, you had the commanders at Guantanamo complaining, including publicly, like to the Wall Street Journal, sometimes we just got the wrong folks. And then eventually, when the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts could hear habeas challenges by detainees and the government scrambled to try to figure out why people were there, it didn't even accuse over half of the people detained of having taken any action against the US. Forget like evidence or proving accusations. They didn't even make the accusation. Unless you are willing to treat a demographic group in an incredibly prejudiced way and deny them rights, you won't end up in that sort of scenario. And I think it's incredibly instructive today when, even if the idea is like we're getting the undocumented immigrants who have committed serious crimes, and then in fact we're locking up anyone who some white guy thinks looks like he's not an American citizen, that you're going to end up detaining, in this case, 75% of their detainees have no criminal record at all. That only can happen when there is the demonization, the dehumanization, and the accompanying denial of rights. So in a sense, that was those fundamental assumptions, which are dehumanizing in and of themselves, is what led to the creation of the base. Then once people were at the base, I think of the story that Jobber, my client and friend, told about being in an interrogation and a female interrogator smeared menstrual blood on him. And when he told me that, I'll admit I didn't believe him. I thought, like, I just can't picture an American woman doing that. I don't know. That just sounds crazy. About 3 months later, when the ACLU had FOIA'd reports written by FBI agents who were observing at Guantanamo, one of those agents said that he had observed a female interrogator take red dye, pretend it was menstrual blood, and rub it on a detainee, and it prevented the detainee from washing. The theory behind that odd technique was, well, if he thinks he's got menstrual blood on him, he can't pray because he won't, it's the opposite of performing the ablution you need to perform before prayer. And then he won't be able to rely on his faith and religion for strength in resisting an interrogation. In retrospect, I felt pretty bad about not having believed Jobber. Or in another instance, he said that he was interrogated, shackled, and someone put an Israeli flag and an American flag wrapped around his shoulders and said, there's a holy war going on right now. And the Star of David and the cross are on this side, and the crescent as a Islamic symbol is on this side. When he first told me that, I didn't really believe him. I thought, God, he's been here forever. Who knows what he's imagining? That just sounds freaking bizarre and unlikely. A few months later, I'm reading these FBI reports, and an agent describes a detainee who was sitting there wrapped in an Israeli flag. So, that kind of example of pure, immediate, direct dehumanization, that's almost inevitable when you create a detention system based on an assumption that Muslim male, yeah, let's lock him up.
Yeah. We're at 12:50 now. I want to open up questions from the audience and see if anybody has anything that they would like to ask Josh about his work, his life, his career, his experience at Guantanamo, anything like that. And you can think I have many more questions myself. I can continue, but I definitely want to give you guys ample time and chance to speak with our guest. Steve.
Thank you. And Josh, thanks for the work that you've done at Guantanamo. And the work that
Maybe you could say a little bit about who you are too.
I'm Steve Miley. I'm a faculty here. I teach refugee law and immigration law. Co-supervise a clinic where students represent asylum seekers. So
Ground zero.
And welcome to Ground Zero. And so that try and relate it to the and see what your thoughts are on a couple of fronts, because you talked about expectations that lawyers have, that you had when you were doing this work in Guantanamo. And for two things that struck me about what you were saying. One is that the rule of law applies, right? You were advocating in court because you had the trust that on some level, and it turned out to be true in the US Supreme Court, that rights would be vindicated. We didn't have that anymore. That's what the second assumption is accountability of governmental officials. Because the other thing you said that was interesting was that at some point, I think it was the guards who were at Guantanamo said, we got the wrong people. We made a mistake. That doesn't happen anymore, right? All civilian demonstrators are domestic terrorists before there's any examination of any, or even if there is examination of evidence, because the evidence is distorted. So I guess my question is, as a human rights lawyer, who has operated in countries, not just in the US, but other countries where the rule of law has been compromised, how do you proceed when you don't have the expectation? How should lawyers proceed? How should law students proceed who want to do this kind of work when the expectations of a rule of law and the accountability of public officials has been so compromised?
So, not to slavishly go back to the book, but it is true that the Supreme Court in 2004 said there's jurisdiction for federal courts to hear these claims. However, the government nonetheless persisted in making non-substantive jurisdictionally related arguments that even though courts had jurisdiction, that didn't mean the Supreme Court had held that people actually had enforceable rights, all of which led us to conclude fairly early on, we're not actually going to get a court hearing anytime soon. And we've got clients who are sitting here utterly desperate, including Jobber, who experienced hopelessness in a more abject way than our other clients. Just to say, he also has an incredible sense of humor, and there were, moments when we would be cracking each other up. So I want to paint him as a full human being. But once we decided that if we get a hearing, it's going to be so many years off that who knows if our people will still be alive, we said it's time for a plan B. We're going to keep litigating this thing because we need to keep going down to the base, and the litigation lets us go down. But really interesting to note how all of the detainees from Western European countries have been transferred back home, even when they were accused of stuff that was much more serious than our clients. All right, so that can't be a coincidence. It must be that Tony Blair or Jacques Chirac or whoever else was at the time in Western Europe said to the Bush administration, come on, we're friends. I'm taking so much heat at home about having our people at Guantanamo. It's the most infamous detention center in history. Send them back. Our clients are from Saudi and Bahrain. Obviously, that's not anywhere near Western Europe, but they are, and sometimes it's horrible to say, viewed as critical US allies. we said, well, why can't that same dynamic be brought to bear here? And once those realizations came about, I spent at least as much time doing press for our clients in the US and in their home countries and otherwise internationally, and lobbying in the Middle East to get those governments to act, negotiate diplomatically, and bring our people back. So we'd go to Bahrain and have a press conference, and there was tons of interest in this, and we'd say, let me explain the US litigation process right now. This is where we're stuck. This is how long it's going to take. These are our clients' conditions. This is their mental state. If Bahrain wants to see its people come home, it has to be the king. The king of Bahrain has to undertake this as a personal project. And over the course of several years, little by little, our clients came home through those diplomatic negotiations. Now, why could that be relevant today? I mean, I don't think we're going to ask other countries for help, but the idea that we need to pull out all the tools from the toolbox, and one of them is litigation. And I've gotten some good wins in district court in the last year, which haven't been reversed on appeal yet. So that's a way to push back a little bit. But also, even if you're a litigator, you should be thinking about other ways of resisting, whether it's supporting an advocacy group or doing non-litigation advocacy yourself. I think that we really don't know what will work, presuming there's something that might work. And so pushing back little by little, using whatever strength you happen to have, is really as necessary as it's ever been. Certainly, I don't make myself feel better going to bed at night thinking, just can't wait for the Supreme Court to rescue us. If I think about the Supreme Court, I start thinking, what should we do other than litigate? So everything, everywhere, all at once, as the title of a movie I haven't seen goes, I think.
Yes.
I have a question. Did you explore the UN system for the protection of your clients in Guantanamo? And it's very tricky in the case of US, but it's interesting. Be interesting to hear about your experience.
We did. We spent time with special rapporteurs on various topics, both in Geneva, in New York, sometimes, through a conference that Amnesty International would hold. Very much as is the case today, the Bush administration, I don't think, was particularly concerned about pressure from UN actors. So while that was helpful in raising these issues globally and generating noise, which I always thought had a utility, it wasn't really a direct pressure point. But again, we were in that context also operating under one of these everything everywhere all at once theories. So yeah, we did engage there. Of course, the US has decided it won't even be part of its periodic review now, so they're just amping up that approach.
Questions?
Can you talk a little bit about how you became in your current position, the Human Rights First, what your career path was, a little bit more about what your experience is right now in your current position and sort of like what you envision for your organization and civil society?
So starting with taking on the Guantanamo case, at first organically and then officially, I ended up with a little niche at a moderately large commercial firm where I spent about half my time on pro bono stuff. So I was definitely the pro bono weirdo amongst, a bunch of litigators. But that allowed me to stay at a firm. Otherwise, I don't think I could have hacked it. Firm support for pro bono is the kind of thing that can fluctuate, often depending on, like a single managing partner's mood or predilections. And so it came to a point where that wasn't really a viable option anymore. Human Rights First, which years ago was founded as the Lawyers Committee, and coming towards its 50th anniversary sometime soon, has a history of doing both litigation and also non-litigation investigation and advocacy. Obviously, I did a lot of litigation in my pro bono niche, but I also had for many years, did human rights investigations in the field, advocacy relating to them, and I wanted to be able to do both kinds of work. Not a lot of places pursue those twin tracks. I mean, if you go to Human Rights Watch, you're not doing any litigation. If you go to Amnesty International, you're not going to do any litigation. There are other places, if you go to the ACLU, you're not going to go to Syria and do a human rights investigation. So it was one of, just a few spots where both of those things could happen. I started, 2 weeks before the inauguration last January. So we've been reacting to a million different things. It's funny to be having conversations in a domestic context that I've only up till now had in far-flung countries, but talking about civil society, the amount of funding that has been sucked out of that space just in the last year is astounding, and has led to lots of challenges for the organizations that make up civil society here in the US. So, I always look around the room because I'm sure somebody is much smarter about these really global issues, and maybe somebody else has figured out a way to escape this morass. I'm just thinking we have to keep scrapping and scraping by, and eventually hope that things break a little bit more in our direction. But there hasn't been a more challenging moment in modern U.S. history, maybe since McCarthyism, if that's, modern U.S. history.
Thank you, Josh. I want to turn the floor over to our Human Rights Center student ambassador, Sarah Gross-Perdekamp. She has a few words and a question.
I think I could just project. Is that okay, or do you want me? Sounds good. So thank you, Professor Roberts, and thank you, Josh, for such a powerful and grounding conversation. Thank you also to Amanda Lyons and the Human Rights Center for organizing this session and for all the work you do to promote rights, especially through these challenging times. And thank you to all of those attending today and showing your commitment to human rights and your interest in learning how we can make a difference together. As Professor Roberts already said, I wanted to make a couple comments just from the student perspective and work with the Human Rights Center a lot. So today's discussion lands at a moment that feels uniquely heavy for us in Minneapolis, and honestly across the country. We're living through a period where defense of human rights no longer feels abstract or distant. It's happening here in our communities, on our campuses, and in the streets outside this room. We've seen the killing of activists, escalating immigration enforcement actions that disrupt families and communities, and growing efforts to suppress dissent, protest, and accountability. Against this backdrop, today's conversation reminds us of something essential, that moments of democratic stress are also moments that demand clarity, courage, and sustained engagement. Josh, your work at Guantanamo to international human rights investigations to impact litigation here in the United States shows us that accountability is not automatic. It is built often slowly by people willing to use the tools they have, even when achieving change feels unlikely. So as we leave today, I hope we take with us not only a clear understanding of the challenges we face, but also a sense of responsibility and possibility. Accountability does not begin only in the courtrooms or in international bodies. It begins with informed, committed people deciding that silence is not an option. And that leads me to my question that I hope to end the session today with. Josh, given the current conditions we're facing here in Minneapolis, where threats to human rights feel immediate, local, and deeply personal, what practical strategies do you think are most effective right now for law students, faculty, and academic institutions to promote human rights and accountability? In particular, how can people who may not yet have formal power still meaningfully contribute to protecting rights and resisting democratic backsliding in moments like this? Thank you again, and I'll let you answer the question.
Thanks for a nice softball question in there. I think documenting what is happening, is something that, regardless of the stage you're in your training, an essential activity. It's probably something that you do better the younger you are. My daughter tends to like take my iPhone out of my hand in exasperation whenever I try to do anything, but in the hands of a competent, dedicated user, there's really critical work to be done in that context. I am sure that there are organizations doing sort of intake work where a smart, organized person who hasn't graduated law school would be really well suited to to receiving that information and passing it along. And I know we've got some lawyers in the crowd who are engaged in that kind of thing. And I understand that right about now there are some students out protesting, and more power to them. That's a tried and I think still true tool of a democracy. So it's hard to discourage peaceful protest. And I would love to hear everyone else's better ideas for other things to do, because my own limited perspective is, it's limited.
Thank you again to both of you. And I think this was a really fruitful discussion, so we appreciate it.
Very much.
Please join me in thanking Josh.